Welcome to the Way of the Wandering Wizard. I am, as always, Robert Andrew Meredith Kennedy. I am a pure and open channel for the finest vibrations of divine love and light, made manifest here, in service to Gaia and those who travel with her. Though most folks know me as Bob the Wizard, some Gandalf Bob the Wise, many more as that weirdo in the kilt, and a lot more besides. I've entitled this little video Rude Awakenings and Living the Dream. Very much describes my life. Back in 2012, while laying in a hospital bed, trying to process an out-of-body experience, a near-death experience, while in still considerable amounts of pain and copious amounts of painkillers, I started the journey that I've just shared with you, gaining a resolution of quite what had happened. The person speaking to you today is obviously changed by those experiences in the same way that each and every one of us is changed by our daily experiences. Every morning when we wake up a little more different than the one that went to sleep the night before. The process of the evolution of the mind. Thanks, Pop. It's been an intense journey. It's a journey that I couldn't have completed without the experiences of 2012. The simple fact is that in 2012, part of me stayed awake, for want of a better way of putting it. That part of me has been awake for the last decade. It was an amazing awakening to be able to see myself through space and time, my long history, that understanding that a bit talking to you is a part of something much, much bigger. I call that bit Meredith because it makes sense to me. It's just a label. Now, in the course of from 1969 onwards, what was a relatively normal life with a series of awakenings, and they were gentle awakenings to a wider world, to the spiritual path, as well as living a good life, as described. Some detail. Thanks for watching. That life taught me a lot. It gave me the capacity to survive, the resilience to survive the accident. It's given me the resilience to survive the great breakdown. It gives me the resilience to open-heartedly speak to people on YouTube. So from a soul's perspective, I can see the purpose of my life, and that's something that in future episodes we'll go on to discuss. The fact that all of those experiences, as I said, came to a head in 2012, and I saw light is light, and in retelling that tale of all this shit needed to be sorted out, and following the path of the Gnostic, as described many times, of knowing yourself in light is light, dark is dark, and the occasional ego wails of, what have I done to deserve all this? I was shown. Bizarre series of circumstances, unique set of triggers that just loaded and loaded and loaded and loaded me up. Sort of like this. Over the last decade, I have been gradually unravelling. And that, folks, is pretty much what I experienced in 2022, in January of this year. That process of being within, looking at all of this stuff, all of these experiences, building energy and emotions and pressures until it just got to a point and shattered. The The outfall, as I've described, was emotional, chaotic, but in many ways our emotions are energy, in movement, in motion. That those powerful emotions, when they finally broke out, carried me off, or carried my mind off down some very deep parts of my mind. Parts of my mind that I could only describe as ancestral memory. They didn't feel like me, although they felt like part of me. They were rude awakenings. I'll describe a little bit. So I did, hang on a minute. I had recorded a great video, lengthy, of all the dark dreams that I had as I faced what have I done to deserve this. And in many ways, it was a process that I needed to put myself through in order to clear parts of me, parts of that great burden that I've carried. And the awareness that many of those burdens that I've carried necessarily mine. Burdens carried long down lines. Now I've tried to work out why my experiences have been the way they are since 2012 and came up with a series of conclusions and hypotheses. As an awareness of soul and energy, there is that level of understanding. So, in many ways, the process that I've been undergoing as a wizard is the resolution of my own mind, the darkness, the light. To experience that while in embodiment has been intense, to say the least. And the fact that those experiences have been driven very much not by my youth, by my choices to expand my consciousness and my mind by journeying, by travelling, by meditation, by on occasion, by imbibing psychedelic mushrooms, by my use of cannabis. Those allow a mind to get to a point. My experiences in this life were driven very differently from experiences we all have. The heightened consciousness, the out-of-body, the soul-level experience I had in 2012 was driven by pain and by being in a body that was pretty much almost ceasing to function. Driven by pain. The best conclusion that I've come up to from my readings is taken from The Body Keeps the Score. That remembrance of all that it had been through. The other great part of my journey of the last 10 years has been looking at the mind, consciousness, its preservation, what goes on, what comes next, the great question we all face. Sitting here now, probably the best hypothesis I can come up with, having read DMT, the spirit molecule, is that in that pain, in that moment of stress, after 45 minutes of a body in intense pain, losing blood, my body did what it always does in these circumstances. It did its best to bring all of those experiences to a part of me, to preserve consciousness. It would appear from what I've read, and those of you that have read the spirit molecule, that DMT may well be the physical mechanism by which that's achieved. All of that experience brought to the pineal gland, deep within the brain, which fired, which was my experience on the road as described in Into the Light. A very, very realer than this real experience of myself as consciousness, as a soul, meeting a guide, meeting groups, aspects of me, aspects of my soul group, I can't know. Deep parts of my consciousness, maybe. But certainly having that expanded consciousness of a much greater sense of self. than this poor imitation of what we all are, as souls, as minds, projecting into this wonderful reality where we experience life. It certainly became clear to me that the purpose of life is to experience life, is to have our emotions. These are the energies that drive the experiences. That I've had an emotionally intense life, being very sensitive, as in open to the energy of life, being very aware. It was a life that I chose. Certainly I signed up for this. I can't point a finger and blame anyone else. And even those that I've tried, as we always find in the journey, the ways of wizardry is a game of smoke and mirrors, folks, within your own mind. Quite often, the part of us in another that enrages us is a part of us. It might be a part of us from our distant past, but it's still a part of us. It's an interesting point to find myself in, where I quite literally signed up for it. Can't blame anyone else for it. No, as I taught my children, can't go over it, can't go under it, can't bypass it or avoid it. You just live through it. It has taught me, reminded me, given me an opportunity to experience myself in the body that I have no recollection of before. My experiences while in hospital in 2012 certainly were quite light. That needed to be in some way balanced. It's horrific as the 2 weeks that I spent in mental health care was for me personally, on the inside. Balanced, that experience. I've now lived my lightest light, my darkest dark, been sin, my highest selves, sin, my greatest sins. And while I did try to share a moment ago those great plummets through all of the standard guilts of any human that's evolving and looking at not only ourselves but our greater selves, why are we still doing this? Why do these actions still continue? It's probably because those of us that think that have lived them so many times that we've come to the unknowing conclusion. It's time to change. Those experiences have run. And this life, for me, more than any, it's been a life of trying to achieve balance, of clearing my debt and making sure that I don't incur any other debt. I know what I'm like. I know that I can offend. I try very hard to put right whatever I've done wrong. If I have made a mistake, and I do, epic level ones, of course, I've learned to put my hand up, take responsibility for my actions, and absolutely have to take responsibility for your actions. In many ways, my expanded mind of what I've carried for the last 10 years is an understanding of life that I'd certainly quested for. I'd certainly worked hard for. I'd certainly done my groundwork, done my energy work for. That perspective is a gift. Obviously, the joys, many of our paths, of light and dark, bipolarity, manic depression, whatever we describe it as, has given me those depths of where I've been in the past. Not just in this life, though I've had dark moments. My rude awakenings in the hospital in 2022 were a driven loop. I would have nightmares at night being taken from the hospital. And I would be executed by one of three means. A car accident, either involving being rolled out the back of an ambulance, being chained to a bed while a car drove through a wall, the usual insane things that our subconscious does, which I consume cannabis to avoid as my body relives my accident. That drove me down chains of violent deaths. I'm not going to relive them. They weren't pleasant. Right the way back, until eventually I'd find my consciousness just diving down these dark rings and holes, until I'd plummet and land pretty much in a cave, surrounded by early, really primal life, early forms, while intense scenes played out around me, and I was part of brutal early life. I suppose the stuff that I've always pushed away in myself. Acknowledge that we are, in essence, while we're here, an animal. That parts of my animalistic behaviour, due to the pressures I were under, were bursting out and driving these experiences, was something that I chose to put myself through at some level. Certainly not consciously. Wasn't very conscious for those 2 weeks. Those were the brutal chains, and quite often the darkest of those moments involved the death of children, the death of babies. It was a horrific place to be in. I have 3 I'll share with you. 3 lives as I track back through. And most of my lives, or most of my things that I was resolving, were guilts. Deeply held guilts. Guilt of abandoning my family, leaving my family, guilt of losing my temper, guilt of killing my family, guilt of... And these were ancient memories. Remembered for a good reason. Before I end up plummeting you all into doom and gloom, those lives, as though plummeted up and down, I was having very dark experiences of imprisonment, reliving lives of torture, and all of the things you can imagine that we carry if we're aware of quite how long some of us have been here. Those chains were something that I've tried to look at while in therapy, while in doing past life therapy. Never really got to many of them. A few key ones. There was a good reason why I'd masked that from myself, because it's overpowering to put yourself through those. The fact that I had very little choice given the regime that I was on. As my fears broke out and I ranted and raved, I was given more medication for a few days. To sit here now, it was definitely a process I wanted to go through. Part of me wanted to be free of those guilts, to know that I have paid my debts. That those were a long, ancient time ago. That they've been carried down bloodlines. Shadows of them reenact and replay. As I and those consciousnesses, souls, have played out that long chain of events. It's just how I saw it. That was how I resolved my darkness of depression while in the mental health. And if I thought it was a depression that was anywhere close to the one I'd experienced before, I was plummeting through that. These were falls from periods of grace into dark pits. The joy of the experience, as strange as it may sound, is that there were moments, as reported in my medical record, of great euphoria, almost charging around the place, announcing that I was a dragon reborn. In many ways, That's how I see myself. Not the dragon reborn, a dragon reborn. That greater part of my consciousness that I call Meredith. It's a good label as any. To be in that yin-yang, light-dark, literally flicking. Now, clear that anyone that's known me, being born on the 10th, 1969, ones and zeros, I think it's clear that, along with most humans, we have a bipolar nature. We all do, folks. It's just in some of us it presents extremely. Oh, not me, clearly I'm a balanced wizard, apart from the odd moment. I'm avoiding the next great nightmares, which were burnings and drownings. And again, diving for a child, a nightmare that I had as a child of a drowned baby in a bath, abandoned, living that life again, and all that came after it, a life of guilt for a sibling lost. Reliving nightmares with my brother that I had as a child, where my temper had overwhelmed me and resulted in the classic Cain and Abel. An old dynamic, not one that played out in this life. Threw a few darts and we're all forgiven. These are not about this life or even recent lives or recent experiences or conscious experiences of more modern lives. These were deeply buried within my subconscious. Some of them, I don't know, possibly even racially carried. It's a little hypothesis. I read a book called DMT and the Spirit Molecule, which explained my near-death experience to me. That in death, as well as losing a body, the body moves to preserve consciousness in some form. The perpetuation of consciousness, now whether that consciousness exists in a quantum reality, in heaven, hell, wherever we want to call it, but in layers of quantum reality, whether the mind continues. I certainly experienced myself in 2012 as a mind detached from a body, not by recreationals, but by pain, by loss of blood, by being that close to physical death, albeit for a very short space of time. It certainly helped me to resolve it, knowing that that peak experience was not driven by something that I'd ingested, taken to calm me down, been given at a party, or indeed gone out into a wood and quested for. The experience was very authentic to me because it happened in an accident. The shattering that came afterwards is basically me carrying burden and load. Those dreams of children lost haunted me while I was in there. Swimming down, knowing that you didn't quite have the courage to carry on swimming for the drowning child. That self-preservation had kicked in and the guilt carried in that life. In many ways, as my mind unravelled, I was being seen where these deep-seated dips, and please bear in mind that prior to the breakdown, these were glimpses in my life. Most of my life was the same as everyone else's. Focused on work, living my life, doing my best to make the best we could of the trials and tribulations that were lockdown, which had quite literally added to my emotional burden, as that brought up a series of remembered family chain lives. Now, I've been aware, and many of us have, those of you who are watching this if you're not, that part of the journey of souls is to clear bloodlines, clear our ancestral past, to touch base with our ancestral chain. And there were certainly points in the hospital, in my plummets in consciousness, where I was aware that I was travelling down a timeline that was somewhere where I'd been present. the greatest part of an awakening, a very rude awakening, was when I looked in the eyes of somebody who seemed very similar to me in their outlook on life at a funeral. Put a hand on my shoulder and just said something which bothered me. But you've always been here, Bob. Parts of you have always been here. And that was at once illuminating, exciting, the perpetuation, and also brought with it a horrific memory of how many lives to get to here. Some of those epic. Some of those have been disasters. The journey of souls. I gave myself a chance to remember looking through all of those from the point that I experienced in 2012 and the expanded consciousness my pain-driven out-of-body gifted me. It's allowed me to resolve a lot, clear a lot. Reliving those sins, those guilts, was useful. I also received the lightest lights, the euphoric highs while I saw and lived all the other lives that had balanced those sins. A unique experience, bouncing in and out of darkest dark to lightest light, driven by fear of the space that I was in hospital. Driven by the fact that a body that was going through a massive UTI at the time, with all the delusions and hallucinations that could bring up, that was bringing up body memories of my own fears of dying of infection, which brought up another great chain of lies and fears, and where those rooted, the body keeping the score. As I sit here now, while the process of the unravelling was brutal and fair near broke me, the bit of me that talks to you now, from a greater perspective it has opened my mind to allow me to do my work. If I had known that that invitation to know my roots would have led me that far down, probably wouldn't have carried on digging, and I'd got to a level where I was comfortable and stopped. My experiences, the fears that I was having on a daily basis within the hospital drove me through that point at which I suppose I'd become conscious in my timeline. The rising shaman in my deep, deep past, and strangely she was a woman. It was a female part of my mind rising out of the darkness. Now that dream was a weird one, because as soon as I made the connection with her, that was ancestral line. I had a very weird experience, and that was that I was not only carrying my own bloodline, my own DNA, all of that information that, having read DNA and the Cosmic Spiral, great read by the way, opened me to the potential that maybe that's where all this ancestral memory is held. And that's a deep thought to be having while you're having a cabin. To have that thought while you're in a mental institution. And that sudden moment of thinking, I've had a lot of other people's blood given to me. Oh shit, I'm carrying all of theirs. It was an absolute mind bomb. In many ways, quite often in this life, when I've visited wonderful places in this life, I've carried a guilt of a colonial barbarian, the invader, the one that's stepping into somebody else's country and laying down the law of how it should be. That old guilt, being part of the British Empire, I suppose. And yes, I lived lives, and many of those carried guilt. Have they resolved? Yes. Have I paid back my debts? Yes. Did having all of that, if not the actual DNA, but certainly the thought of it floating within me while I resolved whatever was going on, my darkest dark in hospital, It was quite a moment. So when I asked myself, what did I do to deserve this? I certainly found out. Chains of violent deaths. The last, strangely, were the great losses, the guilt of leaving a family. Those dreams would start with great lives, really were. The noble warrior, the great generals, not necessarily me, but being part and around those things. A few of those peaky lives that we all have. Don't get me wrong, I've had a few. No names, no pack drills, but certainly those experiences. And with that, obviously the guilt, part of my great meltdown at the war memorial, seemed to be some kind of carried guilt of lying. Men that I've had killed in the past. Strange thing to find yourself carrying after you've lived a life of pretty much peaceful, working in bomb disposal. Done my best in this life never to harm a soul. But clearly was carrying something. Now, I can give you a great chain of those lives. In fact, I tried to. It just took me down places that I really don't need to see again. I've lived that 6 months ago. So in the interest of my own well-being and safety, I'll give you one. The warrior's life, the failed warrior's life. And that is as coming to the end of my life and looking around. It's a Japanese life. I've told this story in many ways of the noble Japanese general, House Mori. The oversight in one of the many battles during the Shogun Wars, where the general was quite literally outplayed and outthought. Poor strategy. And there were a lot of losses. Well, that was very much a part of what it was to be a general. The burden was too much. And so the general decided to take his life. Harikari, the ritual. Death of the samurai. The opening of the stomach. While I was lying in the hospital bed, probably with a UTI, with my stomach cramping, feeling hot, overloaded, I'd be reliving something like these. Be there. The general, having performed his act, nodded to the samurai behind Hashimoto, the bodyguard, who would of course deliver the killing blow and remove the head. All this scene would play out as something out of Shogun. And bizarrely the guilt came, which was what I was drawn to that life to resolve, by looking at the family that I'd left, who there in that culture were absolutely honouring, holding in those emotions, those losses of a parent leaving. Was that of course driven by a guilt that I'd almost left him in this life? Of course, this is how my experiences in this life seem to have run. All of these things coming to a head. Great chains down my mother line, great chains down my father line, finally coming to a point of resolution, re-experiencing, reliving, in order to clear it. It was brutal. Said the fact that what in many ways as a soul was a life well led, but still those guilts of could have done more, could have been there more. Guilts carried from this life, I suppose, in our busy lives, as small as they seem now, driven in the intensity of those experiences with a mind that was quite literally cut free, bouncing light and dark, not aided by a UTI, most definitely not assisted by psychotropic drugs. Whereas my experiences in the hospital, driven to the light by pain, or through opiates and things I understood, my experiences in the hospital were driven by fear and paranoia, safe in the knowledge that I was administering to my own body, or it was being administered, chemicals that were frightening. I've told tales before of the reason why I avoid the term shaman, why I avoid shamanism. Certainly South American shamanism, it frightens me. It always has. While I'm comfortable in Celtic northern tradition, I suppose that's where my roots, my awakenings lie in my long history. There's something about those ayahuasca ceremonies, DMT. Please bear in mind my massive DMT hit was probably administered by preservation of consciousness. It triggered an awakening to the many deaths I've now experienced, those many deaths while in hospital. Ego death after ego death after ego death, night after night after night, for 2 weeks. That's how long it took to clear my personal and ancestral chain. Thankfully now, as I sit here talking to you, the preservation of mind and well-being, I remember much of them, but they were real, really real. The reason why I have jokingly told tales of I don't like South America, with tales of flat-top pyramids and human sacrifice, child sacrifice, was the most vivid nightmare I think I've ever experienced. Bizarrely, again, smoke and mirrors. What looked to me initially as I plummeted towards this, please don't make me live this, please don't make me live this, and landing in a dream, in a reliving, horrific moment in my personal history when I stood on the top of a pyramid with my own child, who was the chosen. And strangely, in a culture that were offering children in the understanding that they would return back to us, reborn within the greater tribe, as messengers back to consciousness of where we were, what we needed. That was the understanding, the transition of souls, the transition of an innocent soul. Does that in any way justify that in a modern context? Of course it doesn't. Ancient times, thousands of years ago, as we sit here now. Strangely, the sin in that life was guilt and doubt. That moment of having taken my own child's life, of had I just condemned her to death, had I condemned her to darkness. That was probably the hardest nightmare I faced while I was in. That guilt of a life and so many lives cut short that were there in life to experience their life, not to be sent straight home. Again, if this in any way reflects with any, this is not about anybody else, this is my journey, my stuff. If anything resonates with any of you, then possibly you're part of it. But these were my remembrances of me in bodies as I relived life after life. The great fear that I've always had when I've been journeying, the great fear of recreational drugs, the great fear of losing self-control was, would I end up in a place like this, lost within those lives? And would I be able to find my way out? Was the fear that I was now facing in hospital. they were difficult times. And what was emerging back into consensus reality, as we call it, day-to-day life as the rest of us understand it, was becoming increasingly fractious while I was in there. Now, as I said, it's a journey of two halves. Whether it was the chemicals, whether it was the experience, whether it was the literally resolutions of these dark lives as I bounced out, terrified, into the arms of, I don't know, some kind of higher self, while I would be fighting battles in my mind, trying to get the higher aspect into form some semblance of balance, while my body was a battleground. Physically, while I fought off an infection. Emotionally, while I cleared guilt, fears, pains, scattered through time. Was intense. The last set of dreams that I was resolving were very much the bounce of light and dark, the trying to find the extremes, I suppose, in order to try and find somewhere in the middle. They were heady flights through highest mind. I'd be euphorically wandering around, announcing quite literally to the ward and anyone that would listen that I was the dragon reborn, that I was bipolar in my consciousness, the ace of spades, the ace of hearts. Pretty much obvious to everyone. Those dreams would be full of great light-filled warrior clans, shield walls breaking through some veil of confusion, marching in to re-establish balances. I suppose my conscious mind was trying to break in to the chaos of the mind that kept plummeting and descending away. I felt stretched as I sit here now. Literally, I suppose that was my experience. I seesawed up and down and couldn't find that lovely middle ground. As well as the guilts, which strangely, when I got back to those early guilts, the worst of them, I said, around children. One was the pyramid. The next two, one was as a male, very primal life. Basically, in frustration and anger, lashing out and killing a child, just to keep it quiet. That was a horrendous dream. The ostracization of the tribe afterwards, of being cast out, thrown out, abandoned, was that being driven by the fact that I felt locked away by my family physically, while I was having physical experiences of being entombed in a small room, held away from nature, held away from everything, the ultimate abandonment issues. Of course, my mind, subconscious, giving me an image. The fact that it had some kind of primal resonance just intensified the experience. The fact that this was being ridden on the back of powerful psychotropics just added to the experience. Plummeting up and down those lines became increasingly quickly, because each one of those made sense, resolved, tied to another part of a web. And as the lines cleared, the plummets up and down would become very, very light and dark. It's almost like sitting there in a moment of clarity, going, I'm going to go back in again. And I would turn. And strangely, in these dreams, hallucinations, whatever you want to call them, The first person as I turned I'd see would be Russell Brand, of all people. Russell, I'm sorry. The fact that I'd just seen the great Russell giving a wonderful show at Crawley a few months before, probably stuck in prime in my consciousness. As a voice, with so many of the things that I hold true in this world, it was clear that some kind of character would be playing out in my mind. The fact that Russell was wearing motley and would be tossing a white ball, a black ball, and a ball that would shift from light to grey was quite bizarre. These plummets back down through, as I said, through to these just deep emotions and losses, the losses of children, of being in a space as a young woman, terrified of something going on outside, trying to keep a child quiet by holding her, and then realising that she'd died. I'd held her that tight. That dream, again, shattering experience to be having. That sense of loss, heartbreaking. Again, I said the dream would start with dear old Russell and his balls and the 3 doors. Probably the worst, the primal fear, I suppose, was when, having bounced up and down through all of those doors until you just reach black, and then open the door and it would plummet down and it would be just black. And then the third one would open the door and it would plummet down and it would just be black. An absolute absence of anything. And yet a sense of self within that. The absolute primal fear of there is nothing, just me. The ultimate ego death, I suppose. The ultimate ego fear. That there'll be nothing, just me. In black forever. If I thought my depression was bad, it was. I spent a long time in a very similar place, but not quite that dark. Those primal descents were harsh. But in time, dive through would become a dream where I would be lying in bed, looking at the little LED, trying to stay awake. A red light would become the circle again, plummet into absolute darkness, aloneness. And then just walking through dark is the only way I can describe it. Deeper and deeper. Trying to find something that was lost. Probably myself. Till on one dream I found something. I got hold of something. It's probably the changing point where I started to regain some balance. The bit that was missing I had hold of. And then I became aware, bizarrely, in the dream. It's not all dark, folks. That what before had been a small group of people sitting around a fire had hold of me. And those people were sitting in patterns. Patterns of 4s, patterns of 3s, then a pattern of 2. And that was what I was falling through. Literally sitting facing another with it's you or me. Those horrendous realisations of consciousness of, oh my God, am I the devil, I suppose? The 2 extremes, is it just me? The ultimate ego trap. Well, thankfully, as bizarre as it sounds at either one of those ends, when I finally got there, having gone through, found that little bit of myself, pulled it back into something, regained, I don't know, part of me that feels like it had been lost for a long time. A long time. Started that resolution. Had the same dream the next night. A few nights after. Well, I was in a much better space as I was starting to come into balance in the hospital. First one was just a dive and I think I got lost. The second dive in, as I said, as I started to come more into myself, was starting to function, still highly erratic, still highly stressed, still highly agitated, but at least not plummeting and having hallucinations in the day-to-day world. That dive in, I found part of myself. It was a weird dive. As I said, I became aware of far from plummeting, falling, a lost soul plummeting through chains and groups that couldn't catch me, to being actually held by increasing circles, the backs of ancestors, as I'd quite literally find myself being handed back up, carrying the lost child, the part of me that was broken, the part of me that was shattered, back up. I had one more dive in, knowing what it would feel like down there. And it really was the part when I was looking at a part of myself going, don't make me do this again. But I had to be sure. And so again, that horrific nightmare of looking at the red light. Strangely, quite often in that dream, the trigger would be a nightmare. Being shot between the eyes. Kennedy assassinated. With all the delusions that can bring. All the paranoia. All of the conspiracy theories that float around my mind at times that I've moved away from in later life. They've got me now. Bang! Down I'd plummet. 3 sets. It was a dark dive, and again, dark dive into this space of just utter loneliness and abandonment, to find a fragment of myself wandering in circles, I suppose. The way that I see it playing out now, although I know that I made those dives many times, is that it found 3 parts of me. Shattered love, that shattered wisdom, that shattered power. Deep in my psyche. Primal psyche. Primal fears. In many ways, the bouncing back up the Jacob's ladder, shall we say, of souls as I relived all of that coming back up to this life here. Motherline, fatherline. How it's all played out. How in this life, as close as it's come to so many of those experiences, step back from the brink, as so many of us have, has put me into a remarkably good space, despite describing all of that. Those were my roots. I now know them, my ancestral roots. A part of me has been here forever, and will always be here. That's comforting to me now. Not in this form, but in some form. In service to Gaia. The fact that it may well be a future great-great-grandchild is a constant source of amusement to me and terror to my family and soul group. Thank you for listening to some very rude awakenings. I'm back in the room after those dives. The fact that each day that I woke up from the nightmare that started in a room that looked like my hospital room, Probably explains why I kept trying to change rooms. Maybe if I was in a different room, I wouldn't be making these dives in. And safe in the knowledge the one night that I did try and sleep elsewhere, I went through the same experience, because what was going on while being driven by that space, by being driven by what was going on in my body, was driving my mind down those paths to gain that resolution, to acknowledge that a part of me, whether that be carried in my DNA, whether I was consciously present there, didn't make much difference. It was my mind resolving itself with what it felt like to be lightest light and darkest dark. And I'll tell you this for a fact, folks, I won't be going back to that dark, alone ever again. Found my bits, my 3 fragments to form my flame. And that's the flame that's carried on. The flame that animates this talking to you now. The eternal part of consciousness. It's a wonderful thing to connect with. It's never really that present, but it just sits there, back of my mind. A little reminder. So, there you go. That was my best description, my best sharing of the darkness that I went through in 2022, the lightness that I went through in 2012, the bounces between, in order to know myself, clear my debts, safe in the knowledge that when I leave this life, I will be resolved. Won't be for a while yet, folks. I'm still very much a work in progress, despite all of that. In many ways, the last decade of my life have been allowing me to reach a point of choice. What comes next? Where do we go next? Will I be coming back? Many, many other questions, many of which may include why. So those are my rude awakenings. The fact that those rude awakenings, as I now sit here looking at them, pretty much allowed me to look at what, when it was held right down here, was a burden, held in guilt. And having lived those long chains to get to the point where I sit now, is what was burden is now experience that I can draw on here every day. What I needed to do, put a knot in the bottom of it and make sure I sit about there on my chain. So, what's emerged from that wonderful decade of experience as I sit here with a mere 2 months to go till my anniversary of my nearly dead day? It's a very much resolved Bob. I'll still have my dips, I still have my moments. I'm human. I'm a human being. And sometimes I'd be happy, and other times I'd be weird, and other times I'd be very, 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 very depressed and very broken. The fact that 6 months later I'm out working in the world, living my life, dealing with the same dramas, crisis that the rest of us are doing, without going stark, raving mad. Goes to show that it's been, well, worth the effort. Thank you for listening to probably one of my greatest rambles. As I said, I enjoy the process very much. Wish to continue on with the next series of little videoettes, living the dream. Probably broken down into a series of slightly more amusing, much lighter little sharings along the lines of how to drive your avatar, as in basically you live in a human body. It's evolved over 16,000 years as mentioned, and no matter what we like to think about ourselves, bodies do what bodies do, and learning how to live within those, to control those, to understand those, to moderate those in the extremes of experience that we find ourselves in. It's part of the journey of evolution of mind and matter. I'll probably do a few how to train your dragons, which, for my way of thinking, was the best way that I could find in heightened states of consciousness to describe the expanded mind. It's a dragon. I'm a part of a dragon. It's the way I make sense of that expanded consciousness, the eternal me. It doesn't make sense as a Bob, it doesn't make sense as a human, but an eternal part of me that is a dragon, that works for me. Thank you for listening to my Saturday morning epic download. I look forward to catching you all out there in the world, probably on TikTok, while I let my lighter side out to play.